Bonsoir.
Good evening.
Alors moi je suis Léna Moget, je crois que j'ai
My name is Lena Mouget. I think I was introduced earlier on. I unfortunately have nothing to do with the Ukrainian producer that I unfortunately have never met. I've just got back from 2 weeks in Ukraine. That's my only link with him. And I think that I could summarize my knowledge of animal protection to my reading and the fact that I have 2 children, 2 bunny rabbits, and 5 tortoises. But come to this evening, we're going to be welcoming 2 people seated on stage next to me and a third who will be behind his screen. We have Kautar Archi and Jérôme De Hemptinne. Jérôme, I think you were in the room earlier on. I think I saw you. Maybe you can just step onto stage directly. They'll be here in a few minutes. Kautar is a sociologist and an author. She's thought a lot about social relationships of power and relationships between species. Kautar, welcome. Nice round of applause for you. And Jérôme De Hemptinne, who'll be with us in just a few seconds. He's a legal expert and professor of international humanitarian law. I don't know when Vipulan will appear on the screen. Vipulan Puvaneswaran. You may have already seen him on the screen as he was one of the 2 people in the film called Animal. He was supposed to be with us tonight, but as he loves being behind the screen, he decided to speak to us from very far away. He's an environmental and animal activist. Now, it's always strange to enter into people's emotions straight after a film, so I'd like each of the members of the panel to tell us what they thought of this documentary. Kautar, would you like to start? Thank you. Good evening to you all. I'm delighted to be here tonight with you. I'd like to thank the organizers for having allowed us to take part in this session. So in a couple of words, yes, it was a very interesting film that reminds us of the fact that war does not only destroy human beings, but also destroys other beings, other living beings, animals. And this is a huge step forward to take into account that form of existence in a context such as the one in Ukraine right now. Vipulan, would you like to share your impressions? I don't know whether you've just seen it or whether you saw it previously. I unfortunately was only able to see the images and not hear the sound, but I agree with what's just been said. I have nothing more to add, unfortunately. Jérôme, over to you. Thank you for inviting me here today. I've only just discovered the film. I've only just seen it for the first time, so I have no structured reactions. I agree with what's just been said. The destruction caused by war is always horrendous, not only destruction of human beings, but also animals. And there's no reason behind it. No reason to kill people, no reason to kill animals, no reason to destroy private homes, personal homes. It's terrible. There are military objectives, of course, but here it's not the case. And what's very touching is to see people rallying together, gathering together and trying to defend and protect animals. We have large animals, monkeys and lions and so forth. They always affect us a little more, possibly, and I'm affected by that because we get the impression that small animals are less important, and yet here we're in a situation of war, but in non-war situations, animals are killed too. Over 3 million animals are killed per day in France. And that doesn't really affect us. It affects maybe the younger generations more than the older ones, but less so than these images. And what affected me watching these images is that it's the animals that give a bit of humanity to things. These people rally round in a human way to save animals that we may sometimes view as horrible animals, beasts, and they are the ones that give a bit of humanity to war, which is quite paradoxical. So those are my initial reactions. I watched this film with two groups of people. On one side, there were young children, and on the other, there were elderly people. And what struck me was that the children's reactions were, what we're doing to animals is absolutely horrific, whereas the adults' reaction was, well, the adults were more or less all journalists, war journalists, and had worked in Ukraine, and their reaction was, well, this is great, people working for animals, but is that really our priority when so many people die in bombed homes? So it is interesting to see that when we were called, we were told that it was the first time that a session was being organized on animal rights, despite the festival having been around for over 20 years. So what I'd like to know from each of you is how your thoughts evolved from the starting point to where you stand right now. What are your opinions? How has your activism evolved over the years? And I'd like to look at your path, historically speaking, and how you've reached your current situation. So I'll maybe start with Vipulan. Sorry, I used the informal form in French, but I guess because we know each other in a certain way. So how has your thought evolved? We discovered you in the film called Animal when you were 16, and what struck me back then was that the documentary started out with your activism as an adolescent, and it was quite advanced. You were a strong activist even when you were just 16. What pushed you into becoming an activist was climate change, and then bit by bit, your way of thinking evolved throughout the documentary as time went by. Could you tell us what happened, how that came about, especially for those of us who did not see the documentary? Yes, of course. I didn't mention it earlier on. I'd like to say that I'm really upset at not being with you today, but I've had to be admitted to hospital. Thank you for making it possible for me to be with you nevertheless. To answer your question, I think that similar to many people in my generation, I dealt with issues through climate change, and it was a kind of technocratic fight where we had to find solutions, technical solutions, and that illustrates what I do. It's environmentalism, which for me is the idea that you could merely protect nature as an entity that's external to human beings, whereas the other approach is an ideology with inert matter. And then that brings us to the hierarchy of our fights. We have to fight against climate change, seen as an entirely technical issue, and protect nature without human beings, despite there being people dying due to many different causes, such as the one we saw in the film. And I don't think I need to give you a full list of all other forms of suffering and their causes. And I think that environmental protection as a fight is based on the idea that we need to build relations that are liberating and create freedom amongst species, but also amongst human beings. So it's that vision of environmental protection that we try to defend and what I think was carried through the film. You are the co-author of a book called Animal Autonomy, Opening Fronts of Interspecies Fight. This was published by Michel Lafon. How do you define that title? It's the idea of no longer separating humans from what is non-human, but creating alliances. There are human and non-human interests that can go hand in hand. For example, animal protection, we tend to say that the enemies of that fight will be people who work in slaughterhouses and who breed animals and so on. And we feel that they are maybe exploited by those industries, those sectors, and we think that there can be alliances built between humans who are victims of that model of animal exploitation and with bred animals, because people who work in slaughterhouses 90-odd% have had health issues in the last month, 10% of people sick at home and unable to go to work, etc., etc. So a whole host of different issues that they face. And I think we need to work on that so that people can combat the issues better. Are you still a university student? Yes, I'm in third year in Paris. Do you still take part in a lot of protests, if they are protests? What does your activism look like today? And do you get the impression that the fights are still way too separate, isolated? So there's one fight against climate change on the one hand, another on defending workers that's completely separate from the first, etc. No, I don't get the impression that they're necessarily too separate, in the sense that I think it would be a good idea to create a movement against all violence in the world, because it's not precise enough. You don't know what you're targeting exactly. I think you need points of convergence without necessarily falling into the concept of a whole where you lose definition. Currently, I'm working on people who are exiled in Paris and taking into account the Olympic Games that are being prepared currently in Paris, which are an absolute disaster from a social aspect, but also environmental aspect, and looking at precariousness and social relations. And all of this can be analyzed from an environmental point of view.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I'd like to read a short excerpt of Kautar's text, but it's on my phone, so I don't know whether somebody can help me out. My phone is just off the stage in the little room out there. Maybe somebody could bring it to me. Kautar Archie, you're a sociologist. You are also an author, and you initially started out writing novels. I read your first novel that you wrote when you were 22, called Zone Cinglée. Your last novel is entitled Comme nous existons. It's autobiographical, published by Vector Sud, and it speaks to us of the ordinary childhood and adolescence of an ordinary woman of Moroccan origins. It's an analysis of social classes as well. And when we look at your life up until now, we get the impression that you are mainly drawn to issues related to feminism and colonialism, and not necessarily to animal protection. So I'd like to know how you started working on that issue. Yes, looking at the intellectual path used is an important analysis. It allows you to look at the questions asked throughout. So initially, I was interested in Algeria, colonization of Algeria by France, and that was the, I would say, starting point of my research, sociological and literary. And then bit by bit, I opened up to everything that colonialism still represents from a gender and class point of view in colonial and post-colonial situations in Algeria and in France. And what I come across often in that work and that catches my attention is the animalization, so to speak, in my research on gender, in works that are more dedicated to racial matters. And I look at what states set up, policies that alter social relations. And I think that to allow for justification of these relations in time and space, you need to support them with modalities that are solid enough for nobody to challenge them, or at least not challenge them enough to put an end to them. And in the arguments and modalities to justify these relations that are often used in colonialism or sexism or class violence, there is the whole animal aspect and referring human beings to something that is not human anymore, referring it to something else. For example, women, referring them back to their nature, to what one could, well, talk about the indigenous peoples, or women being referred back to their existence as beasts, so to speak, and the fact that there are peoples that are can never be tamed and never be domesticated, and that you need to learn to domesticate and govern. So this animal nature and animalization of humans, this is something that is very present in what I've analyzed, to the point where I thought, well, there are other individuals, and those other individuals are animals themselves. The source group, which leads us to believing that there is a state of nature and a state of culture. And throughout these works, for example, Achille Mbembe and others that I could quote, there is a denunciation from a philosophical and activist point of view. I refer you back to dogs and animals or beasts who need to be treated as such. This allows people to become killable, whereas before then we were not authorized to kill them. But what is interesting is that in post-colonial studies, and I'll be very brief, we often stop at the metaphor. We say, well, there's a metaphor and we have to fight that metaphor. We have to get rid of it. And I agree with that. It needs to be denounced in cases of colonialization and wars and massacres and genocide. But I think you can push the limit a little further, saying, but what happens exactly? What do we do exactly to animals, and how do we ensure that our take on the animal issue evolves? When we say that an animal, often we're referring to either our daughter or our cat, but at other times we're referring to political categories of a colonial type, the objective of which is to withdraw some of the moral nature of a body, a spirit, and a subjectivity. So analyzing that matter requires us to take into account every single player, male or female, and you need to ask yourself what you're doing exactly when you eat meat, when you go to the zoo, when you go on a safari to look at or observe so-called wild animals, etc., etc. So it's important to start out with that question and take into account the animalization of animals, but what stems from that, i.e. animalization of human beings.
L'extrait que tu avais écrit, donc c'est publié dans...
So, what I just read, the text I just read that you wrote, was published in a publication called Ballast. And in that text you say that you're... And here I'm reading. For once, they're telling me to touch it and not be afraid of it. And if I'm not mistaken, there was at the entrance of a huge zoo. I don't remember how I got there, but I do remember that I take a step and then another, and I end up touching the feathers of a peacock. Photograph was taken that day, and many years later, people have been reminding me of the chance I've had that day. All of us should ask ourselves, where are animals in our lives? What is their place, and what is our place in their lives? There is a relationship between them and us. We tend to think that animals are only what they are. They're only a fish, a pigeon, an ant. We consider them so different, so intrinsically different, that they are inferior to us. And they're so inferior to us that we can consider them as things without wondering what it does to them, what impact it has on them, and what impact it has on the environment. This is the fruit of Western thought that is based on modern reason and dualism between humans and animals. That would make us human nature because they would have an animal nature. I will stop at this, but I do invite you to read the text. Jérôme, let me turn to you, because looking at your biography, a number of questions came to my mind. If I understood correctly, you worked for 20 years for the UN. You've worked for the Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia. And as far as I know, in the legal texts, there's nothing or not much about the rights of animals. What can you tell us about your experience of 20 years working for the UN, and why do you consider that this is not normal? Well, I'd like to come back to something that you mentioned and I find important. You know, watching the film, we think, well, all that time and resources and energy dedicated to saving animals, while the situation that human beings are undergoing terrible. It's terrible in Gaza, in Ukraine, Mozambique, Ethiopia. Millions of human beings are dying in terrible conditions, and people who die don't tend to be soldiers. They are civilians, women, children, and very often they have nothing to do with the conflict. And when you watch the film, you know, you can think, well, you know, the children in Gaza, they're not doing as well as the animals over there, you know. Children in Gaza are they undergo surgery without anesthesia. They're being amputated, they lose limbs. And, well, I worked with a number of people on the question of the rights of animals in the time of war, and we contacted many experts in the field, and the first reactions we got were, you know, when there's a war going on, there's something else to do than protect animals. But in the end, you know, we started thinking, why not? Maybe we can give some thought to that. The fact that we need to protect human beings in wartime, that's one thing, but it doesn't prevent us from protecting animals. As long as protecting animals doesn't have an impact on protecting people, I don't see why there would be a problem. And you can see there's just a handful of people who mobilize and get organized to protect animals. So I think those are two different things, and protecting animals doesn't have any negative impact on the fate of humans. And you can see it very well in the film, you know, animals are sentient beings. They're not objects. You can see that they're afraid. You can see dogs running around. Of course, it makes sense to protect them. Now, I don't remember your question anymore. So, in the law of war, is there something about animals? And the book that you mentioned is only available in English, so you won't be able to find it in the bookstore downstairs. If we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Law of War, it dates back to 1949, and it focuses on war prisoners, civilians, situation of occupation, people who are injured, and so on. There's nothing about animals. Then there are the conventions that were adopted in the 70s, so that wasn't so long ago, and in those texts there's nothing about animals. Animals are described as indispensable to the survival of a civilian population. So the idea is animals are there to feed humans, that's it. So in times of war, you can't just do whatever you want. You can't kill anyone, you can't kill civilians, people who are ill, people who are injured, but you can't either destroy objects which are not military targets. So it's difficult to decide what is a military target or not. A bridge, for example, can become a military target if troops are crossing it. But where are animals within all of this? Animals are not military targets unless they are used in the military context. For example, horses mounted by troops. If you want to hit the troops, you will hit the horses. But nothing prevents us from applying the conventions to animals. And there is one object in particular which receives extra protection. It's the environment. The environment is considered in the same way as the civilians. It's a bit difficult to explain in a few minutes, but fauna and flora are part of the environment and therefore should be protected. We could also consider that endangered species could be considered as cultural goods. So, but concretely, the scene that we saw in the film where you could see that the troops shot the ostriches, you know, as if they were at the fun fair shooting balloons. You know, in international law, could we sue the Russians for war crimes for what they did to ostriches? What charge would be retained against them? What would they be charged with? And if you were to change something in IHL, what would you change in that matter? Well, here we could consider that it's a case of destruction of civilian property, and in some cases it can be considered war crime. But you won't find any case in front of international court that will focus on that specifically and on animals. No, I don't know about any such cases, but maybe in the future they will come up. Of course, considering animals as objects is not ideal. 124 countries have adopted legislation by which they do not consider animals as objects, but as sentient beings. You know, they are sentient beings that can feel pain, that have a certain form of consciousness and intellectual faculties. So as sentient beings, they receive more protection. There's also the transportation of animals, and the slaughter of animals needs to happen. And slaughterhouses need to happen in under certain conditions, even though it's quite paradoxical. So what would that change in the context of war? Well, we could consider that if you work for the military, for example, and you come across animal, then you have to give them a certain level of protection. You need to provide them with water or food, and not consider them as movable objects which are at the mercy of man. There are still animals that are used to military ends. In the US and Russia use dolphins in their military because dolphins are very smart. They can detect mines and they're very sensitive. So in that case, you know, you could say that it's not justified anymore. It causes too much suffering, too much pain, especially as now we have the technical means to achieve the same objectives without without having to use animals for that. You were talking about sentient beings. Baptiste Morisot was talking about sensitivity crisis when describing our relationship to living beings. Vipulan, I'm sure you've read him. You've read his works, and the sensitivity crisis, that's something I'm sure you've given some thought to. How has your position changed with regard to that? Because the young man you were when you were 16 that we saw in the film, and when reading your book, it seems that we have a very different approach to sensitivity. Well, absolutely. It's not just about fighting for something that be intangible. It's, of course, we have to take emotions into account, and that also raises the question, what type of relationship do we want to build with other human beings? And we were talking about animalization earlier. That's also a very important question for us.
Baptiste Morisot,
Baptiste Morisot says that co-living with other species entails the fact that we have to give them rights. So what you're both saying is that it can be quite shocking to look at animals and think we're going to save them, but in the end it's a way to give them rights. And Kauta, I'd like to come back to this question of animality or animalization. How does it come about? Is it something linguistic? Does it come from contempt? How do we other someone? How do we animalize someone? Well, it's mostly through the way we speak, the words we use, the metaphors that we use, the images that we conjure up, that blur the frontier between what's moral and what's immoral. And it's a way to move people from one category to another, a category which is open for exploitation and destruction. And that's something that we become aware of when we focus on animal rights. And it's a bit like when you're a feminist and suddenly you take an interest in anti-racism, then everything becomes very obvious. And when you start focusing on animal rights, then all those words become you start to see them, and how we talk about people, how do they eat, how do they behave, is this population compatible with, for example, the French Republic, and that leads to other type of discourse without much nuance. After the 7th of October, we've heard on TV, on radio, and we read in the press a number of expressions that liked Palestinian to animals. And they were treated less well than animals, and all that lexicon is something that we need to be worried about, because when we start saying that human beings are animals, or if we compare them to animals, or if we use the word animals as a synonym to immoral, then we consider the fact that we have to defend ourselves from these human beings, and it always leads to massacre, to genocide, the risk of genocide or actual genocide, which tend to be recognized decades later. So we start with words, as cockroaches in Rwanda and foxes that you need to smoke in their lairs, and we just words come out of people's mouths to prepare for action. And in the world of technology, there's a form of transfer of military innovation that are used to control animal populations, and all of a sudden the technologies are not used on animal populations anymore, but on human beings. I'm thinking here about everything that has been developed in terms of population control for wolves, to track them, to see how they live and where they go in the mountains. And technology was used to study those groups of wolves, packs of wolves, and these technologies are now used in borders in Europe, everything that's managed by Frontex. And those tools are used to control the movements and displacement of migrants, to be able to see in the dark, to see in very long range, and to track through thermal cameras the movements of people. So you can see how the political discourse, biopolitical discourse or necropolitical discourse is crucial. And here I'm not only focused on human beings. Of course, it's important to think about us. All of that makes sense for us, but it's also important when you're downstream to walk all the way upstream and realize that there is a direct relation between that and what we think of animals and what modern West has made animals to be, and how the way how animality is easy to manipulate, and it's a constant resource that is tapped on to justify
à l'égard d'autres populations. C'est pour ça que je dis souvent qu'en vérité,
to justify certain actions towards certain groups of people.
il faudrait moins penser en termes d'animaux et d'humains.
So we shouldn't so much think
Et d'être humanisé.
in terms of animals and human beings, but rather in terms of animalized being and humanized being. So we have all social positions, social role, right? Maybe in Switzerland we could express it differently, but there are countries where history has been forged by colonialism. So this question of dehumanized populations, animalized population, that raises another question of which ones are the humanized populations. So what does it mean, human rights? Because human rights do not apply to the whole of humanity, but just to the part of humanity which has been recognized as human. So maybe one day we will talk about sentient beings' rights of sentient beings, and that need to be protected because they're sentient. Thank you. Well, you've just found a new name for the festival, I guess, Kauta. So you've been working on...
Je crois qu'il y a un décalage. Je sais pas.
Ah, tu veux poser une question? T'es devant nous, c'est pour ça que nous, on pouvait pas comprendre. Vas-y.
We couldn't understand what you were saying. Sorry, did you want to take the floor? Go ahead.
En gros, je voulais dire que justement, ce qui était intéressant.
I wanted to say that what was interesting with regard to what you said is that the category of animal biologically is no longer so relevant. It's more social now. You were talking about the negative aspects of humanity, but currently, biologically, it makes no sense. It's just what is not human. Its meaning has evolved over time. At one point, we thought that slaves were more animals than humans. Women were more animal-like than humans. So things have evolved over the course of history, and we can only understand animalization if you understand animals as a social category and not a biological category. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you so much, and that's a perfect transition. The room has just lit up, which means that we need to take some questions and comments from the audience. I don't know whether you can see the people in the audience, Vipulan. I don't know whether technically we can provide you with an image of the audience. We have a mic that can be taken to the people who wish to speak. Thank you. Thank you for this film that caused a lot of tears to fall, for me at least.
Qui m'ont fait penser à un livre.
And thank you for your discussion, which made me think about a book called The Violence of Humanism. Why do we need to persecute animals? It started out saying that animals don't exist. We've never seen an animal. We see a cat, a dog, a fish, but not an animal. I really recommend it. It's a really interesting book. I did have a question in relation to the film. At one point, when they save that lion, they say, "Oh, you're free." it's wonderful, but then actually they take the lion to a sanctuary. So, with regards to zoos, obviously when I was a child, I thought that zoos were wonderful, but I always felt a little bit uncomfortable, and now I only feel uncomfortable. And when I talk to people who enjoy zoos and the opportunity to see exotic animals, their argument, or what they say, is yes, but we have a right to see those animals close up. There are people who have a lot of money and can go and see them in their wild habitat, whereas those who don't have as much money should be allowed to see them too. Now, I find it difficult to counter-argue, but we don't have the right. Why would we have the right to get animals from far away and bring them here and put them in a cage just for the pleasure of those who want to see them? I'd like to know what you say. What do you feel about this? What would you say to these people? Because I find it very difficult to answer them. Jérôme, would you like to start? Well, this is to do with rights. And it struck me in the film, actually. You think, well, wait a minute, there's a war, but maybe, indeed, a war can be a good thing for these animals because they free them from their cages. But then there's violence, of course, and then it ends up being a bad thing for animals, too. But the issue of rights is an interesting one. There have been a few cases in New York and in South America as well where lawyers fought. It's not the same thing to be a sentient being and have rights. If you're a sentient being, you're under a human being. But once you consider that an animal has rights, things change. If the animal has rights, then you need to be able to justify any limitation to those rights. In the case of these lawyers, they said, but this monkey that's being kept, you don't have the right. You do not have the right to keep that animal locked up. You can, and justice said, yes, you can keep that animal locked up only if you have the right to do so, and there was no right to do so, so they had to free the monkey, and he was freed. So giving an animal a right makes things totally different because from that point in time, the animal is no longer under the human being, but is on a level playing field. There's a beautiful book by Violette Pouillard on zoos and the way zoos are actually something that was created during the colonial period or under imperialism, when people went out to discover new lands, which once they were discovered were considered to belong to those who'd gone out to conquer them. And then there was the discovery of rare species or species that did not exist in Germany, the Netherlands, and France. And there was a lot of deportation of animals, and that is why in the Netherlands and Paris and other large European cities there were collections of animals that were transported over to Europe for the pleasure of the kings, and some governors when things got nasty, when riots started to get organized, said, well, let's open a zoo and that'll calm them down, it'll give them something to do, it'll entertain them. So this whole discussion of animals that end up on lands where they don't originate from is central to the history of Europe. There have been zoos for animals, but there have been zoos for human beings too. One shouldn't forget that. And sometimes they coexisted. Sometimes the Eskimos or the Kanaks were exhibited. And so morally, yes, I think going to the zoo is not to be taken lightly. Vipulan, would you like to take the floor? You don't have a button to press to let us know that you want to take the floor. No, I think what's been said is something I agree with fully. When human beings are put on show in these zoos, they're considered to be animals, a social category, and that's what allows for them to be exploited at a later stage. And I think what we need to do is be able to think of them without using the category of animals. Use different categories, ones that are more fine-tuned and precise, or other terms that bring with them more freedom. The term animal conjures up dualism that we've talked a lot about today already.
Alors, ici et
Are there any further questions? Over here?
Ah, et pardon, vous aviez déjà un micro. Bon, bah, ici.
Sorry, you already had a microphone, so let's start over here. Thank you. My question is mainly for Jérôme De Hemptinne, although the other two panelists could possibly answer it too. And it's related to the creation of a crime of ecocide and it being added to the other four crimes, such as genocide. And I think that morally it would bear a lot of weight because it would ecocide would equate to genocide. It would be interesting from a legal point of view, but then morally too. I'd like to have your opinion on it. Would it be merely symbolical? Yes, there's a strong debate underway at the moment. Should we add it to war crimes and genocide and so on? A crime which is the destruction of the environment. So add it to the International Criminal Court, which deals with these more conventional crimes. There would be ecocide covered by the international courts. There's a whole technical discussion which I won't describe in detail. What would the threshold be after which you consider that the destruction of the environment equates to an ecocide? Conventional crimes are crimes that are to be found in situations of violence, whereas here with an ecocide you would be able to bring to court, take to court not only individuals but also groups or companies. What I wonder about is the relevance of adding it at the level of the International Criminal Court. The ICC is a court that governs on all these crimes at global level. The court for former Yugoslavia only dealt with one issue, and it took it 20 years, whereas the ICC has to deal with a whole host of other situations that are just as complex as that of Yugoslavia. So giving it that additional competency when it's already finding it difficult to carry out the rest of its work, which relates to conventional crimes, is it really a good idea? So maybe we should think of another jurisdiction or structure that would be dedicated solely to the destruction of the environment. That's my tuppence worth. Thank you. We have a question over here and then a third one over there. Hello, I had several questions. My first is kind of related to ecocides. I see that there have been quite a few decisions on the environmental impact on certain actions, the island of Tuvalu versus a certain number of European states because of environmental negligence, which had an impact on the inhabitants of Tuvalu, or France, so versus France for negligence, environmental negligence. So could such legal means be used to enforce a change in behavior and make people think differently? And what about ecocide being introduced into states' constitutions? My second example was actually in relation to a mayor on the on the coast, and they accused the French state of environmental negligence. Well, I think that this would allow things to move forwards, but behind all that, there's a discourse, which is that all of these companies from these Western countries, the environmental impact of which is absolutely huge, have direct consequences, but also indirect consequences on other countries in the world, and they need to be held responsible vis-à-vis these other populations, and they need to provide remedies, material ones for direct damage, but indirect damage as well, climate change and so on and so forth. It certainly could, yes, it's a positive thing. It certainly would move things forwards. How much, that I don't know. But certainly making the state responsible when it doesn't abide by its obligations under a given international agreement is certainly something positive. Thank you. I have a second question, which is more practical. And this is in relation to war crimes. We've spoken of war crimes, but we haven't spoken about the power of the UN or other instances in the case of war crimes. Not much is said in the media. We don't really know exactly what happens after. Well, yes, that's the major issue related to international humanitarian law. There are rules, but what is difficult is to implement those rules, especially when it is parties that are at war. Now, there are means for implementation, and it is not because a right is flouted, as is the case in all wars throughout the world, that right should not exist. Now, as for concrete implementation systems, well, there's the International Criminal Court for war crimes. There are mechanisms of sanction through the United Nations and the UN Security Council, although it's pretty much paralyzed currently because of the lack of agreement between the 5 standing members. Then there are other bodies such as the ICRC, the Red Cross in the field, mediating between the different parties. There's a whole host of mechanisms, but it doesn't prevent those at war from flouting international humanitarian law. and a state some states continue to do what they want. So this is a major problem. To prevent those at war from committing further crimes, the international community should be allowed to use force, and currently the use of force is paralyzed by the lack of consensus within the Security Council. Right, I think this is about the last question that we can take, where you have lights turning on, telling us that the end of the session is nigh.
Last question, no pressure though. Good evening. I have a very straightforward question. I think that the law isn't optimal when it comes to protecting animals, because these days, something that we see very clearly on social networks, they are hunters, and here I'm thinking about American millionaires who go to Africa to hunt down elephants. They and then the animals being killed for their tusks. Some just think, oh, it would be nice to have the trophy, the head of a tiger, in my living room, and they are not being punished. They are untouchable. So the question is there a law or some form of regulation that would apply to those people? Because these people, they're not people, they're not human beings, they're not animals. They have no instinct. What should be done about them? And very quickly, another question. What does WWF do? What do they do about them? I think we should apply sanctions on those people, and also we should condemn companies, because we can still buy crocodile bags or snakeskin bags. You know, there's quite a number of products that come from authorized trafficking of animals. So what could be done in the future to stop all of that and together take international measures to punish those companies and those people? Because it's not because they have a lot of money that they should be allowed to do all that. What can be done? Is there something that the WWF can do? I don't know.
Alors, peut-être qu'on est vraiment sur la question du droit.
All right, well, I'm talking about law in wartime. It's law in peacetime. Well, there is an international convention called the CITES that focuses on that, but it's difficult to implement because there is a lot of traffic of animals. You know, animals are trafficked in Africa, and then they transit through the south of Europe, and then all of those byproducts are sold in Asia, and they also go through China. So it's very difficult to implement because of cross-border criminality. It is not allowed. It is everything that you've mentioned, is an infraction under the convention. Of course, it is difficult to implement, but some people are brought to the courts, the national jurisdictions for those crimes. And animal trafficking is the third most lucrative traffic in the world. You know, billions of dollars just after trafficking in weapons and trafficking in human beings.
Avec quelque chose. Je suis désolée parce qu'on doit vraiment.
All right, so unfortunately we have to stop there and end the debate. But before we close the session, I would like to ask the speakers to give us a recommendation, to recommend a book.
Et il a écrit un très beau livre qui s'appelle
There is a book by Hassan Haj called The Wolf and the Muslim, How I Became Anti-Racist. when I became an environmentalist, something like that. It's a very important book that focuses on colonial issues with a starting point
et comment les pratiques participent elles-mêmes à la
of the
dégradation.
stigmatization and xenophobia and all of that. It's a very interesting book. Vipulan, can you recommend a book? Well, nothing comes to mind.
Déjà, allez lire le dernier livre de Kautar, parce qu'il est vraiment.
Go and read Kawatar's book. It is great. It's a very good book.
Alors, j'en ai qu'un ici, c'est celui de
I only have one here. It's Kawatar's book, Comme nous existons, and you can purchase it downstairs in the bookshop. I really recommend it. It is great. It doesn't talk about animal rights as such, but it is a great book. Now I'm panicking. I don't know what to recommend. Jérôme? Well, on animal rights, there's always there's a singer's book on animals. There's also Animals and War by Jean Arfel called Tu me retrouveras, You'll find me back. It's about two girls. Before the arrival of the Red Army, they found shelter in a zoo in Budapest. There's another book, much heavier read, by Éric Baraté. The book is entitled Bête de tranchée, and it's a book about the relationship between soldiers and animals in the trenches during the First World War. And when he wrote the book, people were quite nonplussed and wondered why he was focused on that topic. But it's a very interesting book. Well, I have two recommendations for myself. There's this by Heidi.news. It's study on anti-speciesist with this sentence: human beings are the cancer of the world. So if you want to question your own existence, you should read the book. And for further reading on human beings and Ukraine, and read stories by people who talk about their country, but who also live there. We've launched Cometa magazine with major figures of Slavic studies. It's very interesting. We've just published the second issue, and texts and wonderful photographs, Ukrainian people who used to be wedding photographers who have become war photographers, and you can see their pictures. So Camietta, and not many animals, but you can still read some interesting stories. And if you want to purchase the books that we've mentioned, some of them are for sale at the bookstore. Thank you, and thanks to the speakers.